Welcome, episode 15 of TR Live. I'm your host, Brent. I've got the usual cast and crew with me tonight. We'll just start right away. Bill, you've got something that you wanted to talk about.
Well, today's Memorial Day, and as our viewers see, I am flying at my house. Johnny and I are here in the kitchen, the 35-star American flag. The reason I'm flying the 35-star flag is because that's the flag that my great-grandfather, Sergeant Alfred Gallatin Sturgis, served his principal Civil War enlistment under. He went in the classic 90-day enlistment at the beginning of the war, nearly died from either cholera or typhoid. It was touch and go for months when he got home. Recovered enough by the summer of 1864 to re-enlist in the 177th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. I have his diary. I have his letters home, so I know a good bit about him. His diary records him drilling the troops here at Camp Cleveland. He had prior enlistment, so he knew how to do that. And of course, the officers were all off getting drunk. In fact, he writes in his diary at one point, "I just did the wickedest thing I've ever done. I went to a beer garden on a Sunday." His father had been a Methodist minister. The unit was sent south into Tennessee, and in the fall and early winter of 1864, he was involved in the defensive battles around Nashville, defending against the last Confederate offensive of the war. And then they were shipped across country by rail and put on boats, and he landed near Wilmington just after the fall of Fort Fisher. His unit campaigned up the south side of the Cape Fear River. They were in an engagement at Town Creek, North Carolina, where he captured a Confederate pack. The Confederates dropped their packs and ran. They knew the war was over. And I have a piece of Confederate battle flag. They tore up their flag to prevent capture. He got one of the pieces, and he rode home that night on captured Confederate stationery. As I said, I have the letter. So the 35-star flag is a meaningful one here in Middleburg Heights, because that experience in my family's history from the time I was a little kid on those experiences of his were very real and very present. I wear his GAR, Grand Army of the Republic Civil War Veterans ring. It was interesting. I looked at the casualty figure at the end of the war for the 177th. They lost 86 dead, 2 to the enemy and 84 to disease. And this was very typical at the time. He enlisted with his best friend, Latham Coleman, from the little town of Lyndonville, now called Wayne in Ashtabula County, Ohio. Latham died of a fever in December of 1864. Of course, it was a huge blow to my great-grandfather. And when I went down to Nashville to go over the battlefield where he was, where he fought, I found Latham Coleman's grave in the federal cemetery just north of Nashville. So to me, Memorial Day has always been something very concrete. It's not about parades. It's very much about the experiences of Sergeant A.G. Sturgis of the 177th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. And for that reason, I'm flying the 35-star flag today.
Very nice. Yeah, for me, Memorial Day has always been about parades and cooking out, because my family are relatively recent American arrivals, so I don't have a history like that.
Many Americans don't, but there's also a surprising number who do. And it's just sad to me that in so many families that history is forgotten. Even when we're talking World War II, World War I veterans, much less Civil War. And we need to think more about what our holidays mean. Of course, it was deliberate to move all the holidays to simply give people a long weekend, to a Monday, so it took all the meaning out of them. But if you go back not too many decades, we still took our holidays pretty seriously. And of course, they occurred on the correct day, and that's part of the reason. It would be a nice thing if we want to start recovering what this country used to be, if we start remembering again what those holidays were and maybe even move them back to the correct days again.
Well, on that note, recovering the country that we used to have, your new book is now out by Arctos.
Thanks for telling me. I haven't gotten copies yet. I've been waiting eagerly for them. Hopefully
It is now available for sale at arctos.com.
Okay, and I hope it will be on Amazon soon. But this is retroculture. This is how to recover the old ways of living, the ways in which Americans lived, virtually all Americans lived up through the 1950s. Those ways worked. The ways we've been trying since the 1960s have failed spectacularly. And I think it's time for not just a book, but for a movement, a retroculture movement that starts to recover the ways that work. So that's what the book's about. It's kind of a how-to manual of how to go back to the old ways.
You know, we can spend forever just critiquing the modern world and not really get anywhere. You have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to act on these ideas, I think, to make anything happen.
Exactly. And you can't beat something with nothing. Simply criticizing cultural Marxism isn't enough. You have to show an alternative. The retroculture book is a counterpart to Thomas Hobbes' novel Victoria, for which I'm proud to say I am the agent. Victoria, which is set 50 years in the future and is the breakup of this country in fourth generation war, is the course we're now on. Essentially, the cultural Marxists get such a lock on the federal government, they delegitimize the entire state and it collapses. And in Victoria, there is a recovery, at least in the northeastern part of the country, the Northern Confederation, through retroculture. They go back to the old ways. The purpose of the retroculture book is to try to get us on that track so that we avoid the future depicted in Victoria of massive fourth generation war in this country. And I think that can happen, but I don't think anything else can beat cultural Marxism. But simply telling them, we don't care what you say anymore, we're just going to live in the old ways because we remember that they worked.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I've read the book. I enjoyed it, but it's been about 5 or 6 years, maybe longer. So I'll be picking it up and reading it again.
This is retroculture. You read
retroculture. I've read Victoria many times.
Right.
Not which was transcribing it into the computer from your typewritten manuscript.
Well, that was a good friend of mine who shall remain nameless, a retired Navy captain, did most of the work of putting it into the computer because, of course, you don't get anything from me in computer-ready form.
Right.
But and it was a massive job, I have to say. But Victoria is the warning. Retroculture is the promise.
So, Bill, I'm sorry, Jeff, you want to say something?
I was just going to quip that the most upsetting thing about reading Victoria was the fact that I might have to deal with eating only potatoes once things get bad. Like everything else, I think I could deal with, but potatoes for a couple years might upset me a little bit, but that's about it.
Obviously, you have no Irish ancestry.
I do not.
Otherwise, it would be nirvana.
Yeah, my Italian mother has spoiled me.
Yes, Italians and potatoes aren't a happy mix. No, it's no. We all know the Irish seven-course meal is a six-pack and a baked potato.
Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about the EU elections.
Well, it's been a very interesting election for the largely powerless European Parliament. In Britain, in France, and in Italy, the real right parties, not the so-called conservatives, but La Liga, Salvini's party in Italy, Marine Le Pen's party in France, and Nigel Farage's party in UK, came in first in those three very important countries. That's a huge, huge step forward for the real right. And particularly important in France, I think Le Pen's victory was fairly narrow, but nonetheless, she beat Macron's party. And I can guarantee you every Gilets jaunes was voting for Le Pen. This is enormously important. The most important election, actually, in some ways, was in Italy, where the La Liga simply swept it. It was a huge victory beyond what anyone anticipated. In a way, one can say that Italy is now setting the pace for Europe for the first time since Mussolini. Looking back at the 20s and 30s, people forget now that Mussolini was very popular, including in the United States. Italy worked. During the Depression, Italians had jobs. Mussolini supposedly said Italy can be governed, but it isn't worth it. But he did govern it and gave it the best government it had since Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor. He made the classic error of the Reich. He got into an unnecessary war and it destroyed it. But up until that point, he had been very successful and really industrialized Italy, which had been almost completely a very, very poor agricultural country. And now, with this victory of La Liga in Italy, I'm tempted to say that politically, obviously not economically, but politically, once again, Italy is leading Europe. And that's a very, very interesting shift.
That is very interesting. I have a lot of interest in Matteo Salvini. He says all the right things, and he's just a very interesting guy.
He is very much in the tradition of the Italian, dare I say, duce. This is how Italian politics works. Of course, Berlusconi was kind of duce light.
He's just kind of a big man figure.
Yes.
Aesthetics are important.
They are.
Captures that. Yeah.
They are. But that's just how Italian politics tends to work. They do definitely like their strong leaders. But Italy needs a strong leader. Italy is, under Mussolini, was tyranny tempered by inefficiency. It was actually a pretty happy combination. And that's sort of the best Italy can achieve, and I think the Italians know that. But the real interesting thing, again, is Italy's political role in Europe, which, of course, has been non-existent since World War II. And now suddenly, particularly with this election, which is a culmination of the rise of La Liga, but with this election, with this tremendous victory, Italy is now, I would tend to argue in some ways, Europe's political leader. Certainly pointing to the future in Europe, whereas throughout the main countries in Europe, the big traditional center parties all collapsed. They all had their worst election results ever. The Conservatives in Britain, the worst election results since the party was formed in the 1830s. In Germany, worst election result ever for both the CDU, the nominal Conservatives, and the SPD, the Socialists. Both parties are just knocked flat on their ass. Now, the German election result is interesting. I don't have the numbers yet for AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, which is the real conservative party. The Greens had a big win in Germany. To understand why, you need to understand that the Germans' relationship to nature is different from ours. And different from
AfD, sorry, AfD got 11%.
11%. Not terrible, but not certainly what we had hoped. The Greens are the big winners in Germany. But as someone who's lived in Germany, the German relationship with nature is very different from our own in this country and in much of the rest of Europe. For example, German houses don't have window screens. Now they have fewer bugs. But it's common, you walk into a bakery in late summer in Germany and there are yellow jackets everywhere and they're crawling all over the pastries. The Germans aren't bothered in the least. Americans would freak out. Because Germans have a very strong romantic view of nature, an attachment to nature. Particularly in the former East Germany, for example, nudity is common and nobody thinks anything of it. This is all part, and this again is a long tradition in Germany. This is all part of this nature worship. And it goes in cycles in Germany. There was a very strong efflorescence of this in the late Kaiserreich. And we're seeing that again now in Germany with the Greens. So this is in many ways the politics of nature romanticism. Of course, the Greens are riding the greatly exaggerated and intentionally exaggerated fears of global warming. But it's much deeper than that in Germany. They are tapping in to this German romanticism about nature. And that's something they could ride to considerable power. The problem is that being on the left, they are, of course, cultural Marxists, which means they also want open immigration. So the real fight in Germany now, again, with the center having collapsed, is going to be between AfD and the desire to preserve Germany as German, and the Greens, who are armed with Germans' romantic attachment to nature. And that's going to be a very interesting fight to see how that plays out. Apparently also the real right did well in Sweden. That's important because there again, immigration is rightly a big issue. Sweden has been flooded with Muslim immigrants, with all of the crime and the rest of the mess that brings. And the Swedes are reacting against it. On the whole, it looks to me like this is a huge victory for the real right, with this very important German exception. And Germany's going to be following its own path here, and I'm not sure ultimately where that path is going to lead.
Yeah, AfD, it seems like it's probably Germany's best hope. Something that annoys me is how they still have to make it known that, they feel very sorry for World War II. And it was a couple of weeks ago, AfD was saying that they wanted to make it illegal to boycott Israel, and like they still have to pay all this lip service to Jews in Israel just to have, to legitimize themselves still.
Well, that of course is historically not surprising, but there's another connection here too that people are often not aware of. The Zionists, the early Zionist movement in the 19th and early 20th century, was anchored in Germany and Austria-Hungary. The two most philo-Semitic large countries in Europe were Germany and the Austrian Empire. Herzl, the founder of Zionism, expected that Israel would speak German. Of course, what else? And I said once to my friend Martin Ben Krefeld, the Israeli military historian, I think that if the Central Powers had won the First World War, it's possible, of course we're speculating, we can't do otherwise here, but it's possible that Israel would have been founded after the war with German and Austrian sponsorship as a province of the Ottoman Empire. And Martin thought a moment and said that could have happened. So whereas our picture of the relations between Germans and Jews is shaped now by the Third Reich, there is a much longer tradition in Germany and Austria of philo-Semitism. In 1914, by the way, when war broke out, American Jews tried to raise a regiment to fight for Germany because Germany was fighting Russia. Russia was the Jews' great enemy. The ultimate nightmare for any Jew was finding himself under the Russians. When the Russian army overran the great Austrian fortress of Przemysl in Galicia, which was a heavily Jewish region, because it was the nightmare for the Jews. When the Germans relieved the fortress, who comes running out to kiss the feet of the German soldiers? The Jews. They've been saved from the Russians. Some Jewish immigrants from Galicia set up camp as refugees in the garden of the Hofburg, of the Austrian emperor's palace. And when someone asked Franz Josef, why do you allow this? He said, because they are also my people. So there's a much larger, much longer term connection between the Jews and Germany and Austria than that lens we have now where we look only at the Third Reich. And that's part of the reason why you see close relations today between Germany and Israel.
Very interesting. Bill, did you have another piece of news that you wanted to get to?
Talk a little, and Jeff may have something to say about this too, as we watch the situation in the Persian Gulf and the attempts of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel to get us into a war with Iran. I did a column on this, which will be up on the website probably in about a week, on the dangers of threat inflation. We're seeing the classic Washington DoD effort to inflate the threat from Iran. We had these 4 minor attacks, obviously designed not to sink the ships, on 4 tankers in the Persian Gulf. And of course, the US is now blaming Iran. But there are other countries who are players in the region who have at least as much reason to do that, hoping to spur a war, which the Iranians don't want, between us and the Iranians. And that includes both the Saudis and the Israelis. So it's not clear by any means to me that it was the Iranians behind those attacks. We have the US beating the drums about the fact that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards have been communicating to these Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria about attacking American troops. Well, if we attack Iran, and I've said this many times, the obvious Iranian response is to grab as many US troops in the region as possible as hostages. The Iranians have been completely open about this. They said last time, 1979, we had a couple hundred hostages. This time we'll have thousands. We were left helpless in 79. We had no answer to the problem of them holding our embassy personnel as hostage. What are we going to do this time? Well, we don't have an answer for that either. They're obviously preparing to do that if we attack them. But the threat inflation industry in Washington has turned us around to say, oh, they're preparing to launch attacks on us first. I very much doubt it, because Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has made it very clear he does not want a war with the United States. Now, interestingly here, who's saving us? President Donald Trump. The Pentagon, and only the Pentagon can be dumb enough to come up with something this bad, said, since the Iranians want to grab American troops as hostages, let's send more American troops. Okay, 20,000. Boy, the Iranians will really welcome that. More hostages, and they'd be everywhere, much easier to grab. President Trump wisely dialed the number back to 900. But you really have to ask, as I note in my column, who in the Pentagon's coming up with this? They want hostages, let's give them some more. I mean, is this General Braxton Bragg or General Ben Butler, the 2 worst Civil War generals? The threat inflation twists and distorts everything. Of course, we see it tremendously in this attempt to present the future as war with Russia or China, which is utter nonsense. Nuclear powers don't fight each other for obvious reasons. But it's all about boosting the budget by inflating the threat. But an inflated threat can also lead you into an unwanted conflict by creating an escalatory ladder, which is what the danger we're seeing here with Iran. And it can lead to just some incredibly stupid moves, like giving the Iranians even more hostages. I mean, the Pentagon seriously proposed that.
Well, we did just give them $2 billion and like $400 million cash. So we've done some pretty dumb things with Iran in the last 5 years. That didn't really help the situation. Basically, we kept their economy going long enough for this to be an eventuality. If we would have just let their economy crash like it probably would have without $1.7 billion in assets, that probably would have happened. But that sent the entire Middle East mixed feelings, because while we've propped up Israel for so long, and Barack Obama said, hey, well, we want to apologize to everyone in the Middle East for obviously favoring Israel for this whole time. Here's $1.7 billion. And
yeah,
that was holding the bag.
That was actually money we had frozen that we released as part of signing the nuclear deal.
Yeah.
Now, President Trump is right that the nuclear deal Obama signed was not a good one, because if we had been tougher in the negotiations, I think we could have gotten a
And you
lot
can get all the hostages they had for that money.
Well, depends on how you define hostage, but we're talking a couple people here. This is a small number now. The larger point is that what President Trump's now trying to get, which is some limits on Iranian ballistic missile development and on their support for Shiite militias elsewhere in the Middle East, I think could possibly have been attained when we were part of a much larger group of powers negotiating with Iran. But Obama, in that sense, gave away the store.
Right.
Trump, unfortunately, is trying to do something that also won't work. With the other powers still in the agreement, he pulled out of it. That was a strategic blunder. Had he stayed in and tried to work with those powers to introduce some of these other terms, in addition, presumably, with some incentives for Iran, I think there would have been a better chance of doing this. But as it is, he's now isolated the United States. Iran is in bed with the other signatories to the deal, all of whom are trying to preserve it, without those additional provisions. And we're isolated.
And you're the bad guy because you left the deal.
Oh, and because if we don't have the deal, then what's the alternative if Iran starts to enrich uranium? Now we're on route to a war with Iran.
Right.
And President Trump knows, as Pat Buchanan has warned him, that it'll be John Bolton's war, but it will be the war that destroys the Trump presidency.
Yep.
Yes. So the pulling out of the deal was a mistake, even though the original deal was a bad one.
Oh, sure. Saudi Arabia just got a huge deal. We just made a deal with Saudi Arabia for like $9 billion with weapons. I think it was last week or something. So it's another escalation. Even if it's not war itself, that's going to be our proxy.
Yes
really
and
just
no.
sends a message with that.
This is actually just helping the balance of payments because we're sending all this money to the Saudis for oil.
Sure.
So how do we get some of it back? We sell them tons of very expensive weaponry they can't use.
Right.
The Saudi military is crap. It would get down in 48 hours against a serious opponent, particularly the ground forces. Now, they have a lot of foreign pilots flying their airplanes and maintaining them, otherwise they wouldn't be in the air. But the purpose of both the Saudi Army and the Saudi National Guard, they have two ground forces, is to watch each other to prevent a coup. Their ability to fight on the ground, they tried to fight the Houthis on the ground. They got their butts kicked real fast. So it's perfectly safe to sell the Saudis any weapons they want. They're just on their way to the junk pile. And meanwhile, we bring some of the money home. Why not?
It's funny you say that their pilots are junk. In flight school, they sent some of their pilots to the United States to have them trained by the Navy. And sitting in briefs with some of these guys, I don't know if it's only royalty that they send to be pilots. I don't know how it works, but almost all of them, had some type of royal lineage, and they had the most I don't want to say pretentious, but they just felt entitled to everything that they were doing. And study on a pilot and the U.S. Navy pilot, so be it. So they weren't very impressive pilots as students, not at all.
Well, if you're a Saudi royal who's a pilot, why are you going to risk your ass in fighter combat? You've got a
Right.
good life ahead of you.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So, yeah, I wouldn't be very aggressive either in a case like that. And they'll just shrug and say, well, we'll let the Pakistani pilots do the actual fighting. Pakistani pilots, by the way, are quite good.
Interesting.
But the Saudi pilots, you're absolutely right. They're all entitled royals, and they are candy asses. So
Interesting.
okay, I have an interesting bit from a column from the New York Times on the 25th. And it's interesting. It's by Bret Stephens. The left lets Trumpism rule the world. What the column is about, and I'm seeing more and more of this, is desperation among what I would call sort of mainstream leftists, Democrats who want to win elections, who are increasingly realizing that the cultural Marxists who now control the Democratic Party are leading them to utter disaster. I mean, the way the election is shaping up now, and up for a long time to come, it's President Donald Trump versus Munchkin Village. And it's looking more and more like it's just going to be a Trump landslide. And surprisingly, given it's the New York Times, and he's one of their columnists, he actually gets it right as to why this is happening. And I want to quote one paragraph. The common thread here isn't just right-wing populism. It's contempt for the ideology of them before us, of the immigrant before the native-born, of the global or transnational interest before the national or local one, of racial or ethnic or sexual minorities before the majority, of the transgressive before the normal. It's a revolt against the people who say, pay an immediate invisible price for a long-term and invisible good. It's hatred of those who think they can define that good while expecting someone else to pay for it. That hits the nail right on the head. What people here and in Europe in these recent elections are rejecting is the ideology of cultural Marxism that always puts them before us. It does so because in cultural Marxism, the us, if you're white, if you're male, if you're sexually normal, if you're a non or anti-feminist woman, if you're a conservative black, if you're anyone except the sainted victims groups of political correctness, you're inherently evil. You are the equivalent in the old Marxism of landlords and capitalists. It doesn't matter what you do, you are automatically evil, you are condemned by who and what you are, and you can never do anything about that. Well, not surprisingly, us, who are condemned by Halat, are rebelling against this. And we're overthrowing it everywhere. And the Democratic Party has cultural Marxism chained to its neck, a giant millstone. It can't get rid of it because it's grabbed the party base. And Stevens and a growing number of other liberal commentators are seeing the handwriting on the wall, that cultural Marxism is dooming them. And of course it does, because it tells the majority here and in Europe, you're horrible, evil people, you can't do anything about it, and we're going to wipe you out.
Irrespective of the facts.
Irrespective of the facts, precisely.
Yeah.
Facts do not matter. So, but I think what's interesting here is that liberal columnists like Stevens are having to recognize this and dare even to write about it and get it printed in the New York Times. And that's an extraordinary paragraph to appear on the editorial pages of the New York Times.
I don't think there's anything they can do about it, though.
There isn't.
That's their entire platform.
That's correct. The cultural Marxism that dooms them, they cannot free themselves from. It's going to take them down, and it's taking them down, and it just took them down, again, in France, in Britain, and in Italy. Now, Grant, you had a couple news items.
Yeah, I did. There's some FBI files that were recently released. They reveal that Martin Luther King may have been a different character than what we have come to find in our textbooks in elementary school and so on. He's a little different than the character that the conservatives like to lionize each year, who for some reason seem to like him much more than the left does. But there's an article here. It says, Martin Luther King Jr. is known for his defining influence on race relations and the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s and U.S. history in general. Whoops, lost it. So it's these files expose the dark traits of Martin Luther King's personality, including his indifference to rape and dozens of extramarital sexual affairs he had while campaigning across the country. These things aren't really surprising to probably those of us on this side of the spectrum, maybe a little bit further, or traditional right, as you will. It's pretty widely known that he was also a communist and surrounded himself by communists, and he had a communist handler to which he had to consult before he spoke about anything, so he knew exactly what to say. So I'm wondering, when do you think the statues to MLK will come down in the city parks?
Well, this will be interesting because it will be the blacks versus the women. The left's coalition is quite unstable and has tremendous hostilities within it. And of course, the Me Too movement is not terribly fond of what used to be called loose morals that one finds in too often among black men. This isn't news. Everybody has known about Martin Luther King and sex for a long time. The Martin Luther King boulevards that now we see in virtually every city should all lead to the red light district. We've known that for a long time. But there's something larger here. There's a larger issue. King is part of a tradition that goes back much further than he does, and particularly to W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a black leader who was a Marxist. And this tradition that we now know as the civil rights tradition, that of course is surrounded by all kinds of hagiography with King and others, and we're all supposed to say, oh yeah, this is this wonderful thing with civil rights. Well, if it's so wonderful, why is the black urban community today in far worse shape than it was in the 1950s? And in the 1950s, those were safe neighborhoods. Kids weren't killing other kids for their shoes or their jacket or because they looked at somebody's girl the wrong way. The problems in black schools were the same as the problems in white schools, running in the halls and talking in class. In the 1950s, 8 out of 10 black school children came home to a married mother and father. Now that figure's 20%. Every study, starting with Patrick Moynihan's pioneering research, later Senator Moynihan, shows that no factor is more important for a kid's future than coming home to a married mother and father. Well, I hate to say so, but by their fruits shall ye know them. These are the fruits of Du Bois, King, and the civil rights movement. This movement displaced an earlier movement that was much more promising for blacks, and that was the movement launched by Booker T. Washington. What Washington argued was that blacks need to show whites that unaided on their own, they can perform at the same level as whites. And in his time, blacks were showing that. I think, for example, of the Pullman porters. The real beginnings of a black middle class were the Pullman porters. Virtually all the staff on the thousands and thousands of Pullman cars that Americans rode every day were black, and in the dining cars too. They gave the finest service you'll ever find anywhere, and always with good humor. I'm old enough to have experienced it. And lucky the black girl who married a Pullman porter, because though he didn't make much salary, he often did very well from tips. They had to be super responsible. The Pullman company's rules were incredibly strict. And the slightest infraction and they were fired. And they did it. They performed at least as well, perhaps better than whites. This is what Booker T. Washington wanted to build on. He said that blacks and whites should work together for their mutual economic benefit, but socially should remain separate. But the key was, whereas the civil rights angle that comes from Du Bois and King is, all our problems are your fault, whites, do something for us, give us stuff. Give us welfare, give us this, give us that, give us whatever. And however bad our behavior, it's not our fault, it's your fault. And Washington said, we're not going to play that game. We're simply going to show them we can perform at the same level. It is tragic for the black community in this country, and it has given us the colossal mess we now have in our black inner cities, of which blacks are the victims. Of course, the black rate of violent crime is 12 times the white rate, and most of the victims are also black. This is a direct result of not taking the road that Booker T. Washington laid out.
Yes, so my next piece of news actually has me a little bit worried. U.S. corn planting is slowest in record for this time of year. The corn crop is 49% planted, while soy seeding is only 19% completed. And that has to do with the condition of the fields, because the Midwest and Great Plains have been getting a lot of rain this spring. So farmers haven't been able to go out and plant. And there's some places are saying that they may not even get their crop into the ground this year. So there's potential for facing a bit of a supply shortage in these commodity crops, corn, soy, and wheat, and so on.
I think that what's most likely here, Brent, we're talking about the big agribusiness farms out in the far Midwest where the flooding has prevented planting. The ground's simply been too wet to work. These are largely for animal feed, or in the case of soybeans, for exports. Of course, the Chinese have stopped buying our soybeans. This is not likely to much affect the crops people eat. I doubt very much we're going to have a bread shortage. I was visiting my Amish friends here in Holmes County, Ohio this week. They've got all their crops in. We've had a wet spring here, but they have a real farm, not agribusiness. And that farm has much better soil. It's much better drained. And of course, they're working it with horses that don't compact the soil nearly so much as tractors do. And they're looking to a good year. A lot of the smaller farms like that in the country, I think, will do okay. It's going to be the ethanol crops where a lot of that corn goes. By the way, most of it's GMO corn, so we really don't want to eat it anymore.
Right.
The soybeans, again, largely for export. Those things are going to get hit. I don't think it's going to hit the food supply, but it does remind us that the historic cure for obesity is famine. We tend to think that with modern science, we have transcended all of these old rules about store food when it's plentiful because there will be years of famine. Well, genetic engineering is, among other things, going to give us real famines again, because both unintentionally and intentionally, there are going to be genetically engineered plagues aimed at both crops and people. And the ones that hit crops could indeed leave us in the future with some years of famine, especially as we are dependent on the monoculture, agribusiness style agriculture, everything Roundup ready, GMO seeds, all of the rest of it. I think here the organic farming community is right. These ways of farming are not sustainable. They're not secure. Having a country of lots of small farms worked in traditional ways, farms that have multiple crops, the traditional farm, once again, some wheat, some oats, some corn, some animals, etc., is a much more robust, if under normal conditions, less efficient way to feed a country. And I'm afraid we may have to learn that lesson the hard way.
We want a famine. You heard it here first.
So we all lose weight?
Yeah. It'd be easier to keep it off in the winter. Right?
Oh, there's no question about that. Yes. Well, remember, it's kind of like I always tell Marines who are very proud of being so thin. In the POW camps, the fat get thin and the thin die.
So yeah, I think it serves as a bit of a warning to what might be coming down the pike.
Yes, I think it very much does. And again, I subscribe to Farming Magazine, which I recommend to everyone.
Great magazine.
It's a terrific magazine. It is aimed at the small traditional farmer, and it understands that agriculture is a culture. It includes poetry. It includes fiction. It's not just a scientific magazine. It includes the farm home and recipes. It's a pleasure to read. And this whole notion of agriculture as a culture, this is part of what we lost in a way when the South lost the Civil War. Because one of the things that war was about was, is our future going to be industrial or agricultural? And I've always been very much in sympathy with the Southern agrarians, a school that in effect arose again in the 1930s and it now has its representatives once more headed by Wendell Berry, whose writings I love. So this is something real conservatives are interested in. We remain very leery of the big science, big ag approach to our food supply. And I am completely in sympathy with the organic farming movement, the back to the land movement, all of the farmers markets, all of the rest of it. These things are fundamentally conservative, even if politically some of the people involved with them are on the left. These are culturally conservative, and they also are important for the security of our food supply.
Absolutely. My last bit of news is good news. The Alabama governor defends Confederate monuments, saying we don't need out-of-state liberals telling us what to do.
That's great. I applaud it. I think this attempt to rewrite history is dangerous. Again, we see it's cultural Marxists behind this, not surprising. They always want to forbid history, real history. I think Alabama and some other southern states, because you have university communities in these otherwise conservative states, that want to rip down their conservative memorials. And I think they passed laws saying, no, you can't do that. These are protected by the state. There's no local option here. But Brent, I think we need something more than that. We need to start putting up more Confederate memorials. If the left doesn't like them, we need more of them. So I would go further. I would say instead of just defending the existing Confederate memorials, let's put up some more. And there's one in particular I would really like to see on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, where they idiotically put up a statue of Arthur Ashe, a black tennis player. Relegate that to the tennis court and put up a statue to the black Confederate soldier, of whom there were a significant number. We know that from pension records and from eyewitness accounts, both Union and Confederate. And there were many blacks who, when their white folk went off to the war, they went with them. Why? Because their country was being invaded, and because they went to war with the people they'd grown up with. Up north, most whites never had any contact with blacks. Down south, they were playing together from the time they were toddlers, whether slave or free. And so very often, when young Massa went off to the war, some of the slaves he'd grown up with went off with him, and they fought too. And that would be, I think, a very appropriate statue on Monument Avenue and throughout the Confederacy to remember the blacks who fought for the South. And by the way, many others stepped forward with the white menfolk gone and worked to keep the Confederate economy running. So the black contribution to the Confederacy was very substantial. When the CSS Alabama went down in the English Channel in 1864 in a fight with USS Kearsarge, 2 of the 22 crew members who went down with her were black. That shouldn't be forgotten.
It would certainly cause a lot of confusion.
Delightful confusion. And we would be happy to explain the real history behind it.
The truth is not always a welcome guest.
Certainly not where cultural Marxists rule. So cheers for Alabama, and keep the Confederate flag flying.
I think that's a good place to end for Memorial Day.
I think so too, because
Agreed.
I went to, and I'll end with this note, about 2 years ago, I went to where Memorial Day started, the cemetery in Columbus, Mississippi. In May of 1866, women from the city, it's a beautiful city, by the way, about 150 antebellum structures. The women from the city came out and decorated the Union and Confederate graves. And this practice spread. My grandmother always called it Decoration Day, but that's where it began, in the Confederacy.
Cool.
Just remember, if you want to participate in the show, send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com. We can read your questions, comments, or if you have a suggestion for a piece of news that you want us to cover, we can take a look at it there too. And as always, you can participate in the live chat with your fellow viewers, and I can take bits of commentary out of there as well and read them live. As always, thanks for listening. Oh, and check out Retro Culture at arctos.com, Bill's new book.
And remember the Walsingham Pilgrimage this coming Saturday at St. James Anglican Catholic Church here in Cleveland, Ohio, 11 o'clock in the morning. And all are welcome to take part in a medieval pilgrimage. I know Jeff's coming.
Yep, looking forward to it.
Great.
All right, as always, thank you for watching, and we will see you next week-ish. Take care.
Night.
See you
Good
guys.
night.